unmute your mic.
That's probably better. There we go.
It is better.
So hi, I'm Chris. I'm 28 and I'm from Bournemouth. I am an organiser of PHP Dorset, so kind of like a sister user group almost to this. I also regularly attend WordPress Bournemouth, which is our local WordPress meetup. And I work at a company called Three-Sided Cube. So we make apps. Probably the most famous is the American Red Cross app and the British Red Cross app. And that helps alert people when there's natural disasters like earthquakes and tornadoes and things like that. So it's quite exciting business, and I like to think in our small way we help save lives in a very small way. Yeah. Occasionally though, we also need to make websites, CMS websites. And for that we use WordPress. So WordPress has a big focus on its users. It's packed full of features that make it really easy to use as a blog or as a website, and sometimes for larger apps than that. And its strength is that it's really highly portable. It can run on pretty much any setup, and it rarely breaks backwards compatibility. So it covers a lot of different users' needs. But in doing so, it kind of ends up getting to stick for not being the easiest to maintain or collaborate with, especially with multiple developers at the same time. However, it's easy to forget it's not there to be my perfect developer framework. So it's not Laravel and it's not Symfony. It is WordPress, and it's all about what's going to be best for the user. And that's why it's so ubiquitous. I mean, after all, it's, I think, 28% now since I updated this like 2 weeks ago, but it's every time I give this talk, that number goes up. So yeah, lots of sites on the internet run on WordPress. And as PHP developers, we have great tools that help us develop our applications. So there's no reason we can't use these with our WordPress installs to make our apps easier to build and easier to maintain, especially when we're working in a team. So this talk is about how I took my WordPress development and I brought it in line with how I worked with my other favourite frameworks. So all these suggestions are just a way to do this. It's not the way to do it. It's what works well for me. If you go looking around the internet, you will find some other ways you can do the same sort of thing. And I'm constantly experimenting with this system, so this talk changes a lot. But what I'm going to say today is what's tried and tested. So the most important development tool, I think, is version control. The most popular of which is Git. So Git's vital because we can see who changed what and when. We can have multiple people working on the same file simultaneously, we can work on features in parallel, and we can roll back to previous versions. And all that is really important because it means we can go home on time. So if you've not used Git before with your WordPress install, you can do a lot worse than just put the whole thing into Git. So let's look at our project if we did that. So here's a fresh WordPress install, and here's Git. But of course it's a CMS, so it's not that simple. And it's because of this. So WordPress has a file editor built into it, which means users can go in and edit some of your files. So that means what's in our repository isn't necessarily what's running on our server, and therefore the point of having a repository is a lot less useful. And there's a really easy way to prevent this. So that's the reason. And it's by adding this line into the WP config file. And this prevents non-developers from editing any of the files, like the CSS file or any of the plugin files in there. Now, you can also do this with file permissions if you want to get onto the command line, but it's nice and easy. And this is an example of how WordPress gives us options to help us customize our experience of using WordPress. And there's tons of these settings. You'll see more of them as I go through. This one, for example, prevents the automatic updates from running. Which is interesting, actually, because if it detects that you've got Git, so if you've got a .git folder in your WordPress install, it will actually do this by default anyway, because it's detected that you're using version control. But I like to be explicit and definitely turn it off. So those changes are in WP config. And we've just made a change to that file, so let's commit that, and that's good. All of these other files I'm not going to edit though. The only files I actually want to edit are in here, in the WP content folder. And that's what I call application code. So that's the code that's going to be different on this WordPress install to my other WordPress installs. All the other files are just going to be the same because it's WordPress. Let's commit that. So I don't want to touch any of these other files. Unfortunately, I've changed these slides to make them 4x3, so I'm not quite sure what's going on up there. So I'm going to watch it with you. Okay, so that's WordPress, and what I've done here is, okay, so just go to that. So I've taken all these files, and I've put them all into a folder to make this a bit tidier. So WordPress lets us move our files and folders around. So all those core files that are not things I'm ever going to touch are now in a folder called WordPress, which is that. So WordPress, WP config here, I haven't moved because it's not a core file, it's actually created when you run the wizard the first time you install WordPress. And it's quite happy to sit in the directory above all the WordPress core files. It will look for it either in its current directory or in the one above. So that's fine to stay there. But now WordPress doesn't know where I've moved the core files to. So when someone hits the website, it's going to hit index.php and then try and load in the WP header and stuff, and it won't know where that is because I moved it. So I just need to tell WP config about that change. So it's just this line here that already exists in WP config. I just literally add the word WordPress to the end of that line, and now it knows where to find its core files. I also need to make a change to the database. So you might be familiar with this. We've got a site URL in there, and we've got home. I think these are poorly named. I don't really know what the difference is, especially when the default value for them is the same. But essentially, if you add WordPress in site URL, then it's going to know where to find those files again. So we're left with this. But where in here is our application code? Well, if we drill down into WP content, we can find our plugins and our themes, and that's really the files that we change as part of our WordPress installs. And WordPress comes with some by default, like the Hello Dolly plugin and the 20, whatever the year is, themes as well. But I don't want to mix my code in with this code, because this is what WordPress ships with. So what I've done here is I've made a folder, I've called it WP content to stay consistent with what WordPress is expecting my folder names to be, and I've put that in the root of my project, and then I've put my plugins and my themes in there. So I've made a plugins folder and a themes folder, and in here I've got advanced custom fields as an example, debug bar is another example plugin, and I've written my own awesome plugin as well. So I need to tell WP config about that change as well. So these lines don't exist, but I just added them to WP config. It's not really too important what they are, you can look those up, but it just tells WordPress where that content is now. So it will use that plugin, that theme folder that I created instead of the one that ships with WordPress. So now I've got a clear separation between what's WordPress's core code and what's my application code. And that is a massive improvement, and I know what you're thinking. So all I've done is move some files, right? Why did 2016 ruin all the good memes? And what does any of this have to do with version control? Well, now we have WordPress's core code contained, we have the ability to do something that I feel the PHP community as a whole could do a lot less of, and that is ignore WordPress. So in my git ignore, I've added the WordPress folder, because I don't need to keep track of that. WordPress has its own version control system, and as I say, I'm not going to be changing any of those files. So let's have a look what that looks like if I check it out from Git now. So I've cloned my repository, sorry it's missed the end of the URL off the end there, and I've got some of my files, but there's one missing. So I haven't got anything that was in the WordPress folder, I don't even have the folder. Now, if I clone this project, if I wasn't working on this project and someone else gave it to me and I cloned it, I could probably work out that it needs WordPress. So I can see a WP config folder in there. So yeah, it's obvious I need that, but I don't know what version of WordPress it is. It could be a really old site, it could be a really new one. The only thing I know is that this project is dependent on WordPress. It's not going to work without that folder in there. Now, if only we had a way to manage that dependency. So we do, and it's called Composer. There's a misconception that WordPress isn't compatible with Composer's workflow. It is, but it's not quite as easy as just using Composer like you usually would. And the reason for that is that it doesn't have a Composer description file. There is an RFC out for it, been out for a while. Whether it should have a Composer description file or not, I'm not really here to debate, but for us to manage WordPress as a dependency using Composer, we need it to have one. Now we could make our own fork of WordPress, put that up into GitHub as our own private repository, and pull that down with Composer to make up that missing dependency. But we'd have to do that every time there was a minor version of WordPress, which is like every day, I think, at the moment. So thankfully, someone's already solved this problem for us. So this is a Composer package, which is an automated fork of the WordPress's core files. It updates every 15 minutes, and it's mirrored on packages, which means you can use it with Composer out of the box. And it's got all the tags and everything, and all the branches that WordPress itself has. And it's had 1 million installs now, so it's not just me that uses it. There's a ton of people doing their WordPress installs this way. And best of all, Composer will install WordPress to the missing folder that I'm looking for. So to explain how it does that, if this is a default package on Composer that I can pull in from Composer, it will have a type of library. That's just the standard. If you put anything up on packages, it will be a type library. And then Composer will install that to the vendor folder. In this case, this has a custom Composer plugin written with it, which will tell Composer that when you go to install me to the WordPress folder, which is exactly what I wanted to do, because that's what I called my WordPress folder. Composer plugins are really cool. If you want to know more about them, come and talk to me afterwards. But for now, I'm going to start using Composer to install my dependencies. So Composer init, Composer require, I'm going to require that package, so I get WordPress, and I'm going to run install, and then I get something like this in my composer.json file that gets created as part of the initialization. Now, if I want to update WordPress, all I need to do is run Composer update, and it will update up to version 5, basically, because of that rule there. And it's added a Composer.json file. And WordPress is back. Isn't that great? Okay. So we have a dependency manager. What else in here is a dependency? Well, if we look in the WP content folder, which seems to be missing from this slide, there we go. So we've got advanced custom fields, for example. I didn't write advanced custom fields, that's not my code. So that's a third-party dependency. So WordPress plugins, like the core, they don't have a Composer description file either. But thankfully, that problem's also been solved, thanks to WPackagist, WordPress Packagist, which is a custom repository. So it acts like Packagist does for Composer, but it's a mirror of WordPress's plugin directory. And this is why I've maintained this folder structure. This is why I called my folder WP content for my application code, because WordPress plugins, WordPress themes that are on WPackagist will install themselves to a folder at the root of your project called WP content. So that's handy. And they'll go into the themes and the plugins folder. So yeah, there we go. I've got my WP content folder there. So that's where it's going to install these plugins. And it does this using Composer installers, which is a requirement of when you require any of these plugins using Composer, it will use Composer installers to help Composer know where to install these things. And this works with all of your favorite frameworks. So Laravel, Drupal, Joomla, all sorts of things it knows about as multi-framework. So that's quite a cool thing to look into if you're interested. At the moment, this isn't available on regular packages, so I can't just do a composer require on the command line. So I have to add this line manually. So tips for getting this right is to get the package name. Well, that's the name that's in the URL on the plugin directory. And to get the version number, I look at the changelog, and that will tell me what the version number is, latest version. But there's also an indication of whether this plugin is using semantic versioning or not. If you look back through the changelog, you can see what kind of changes they make for different versions. You can see whether they're breaking Semver or not. For themes, you just kind of have to use the wildcard asterisk, because they don't usually have any versioning if you want to use Composer to pull your themes in. So this one I've locked down to 4.4 because I don't necessarily trust Advanced Custom Fields to use semantic versioning, so I've told it exactly the version that I want, and it will always install that even if I run Composer Update. If I want to update the version, then I'll update this number manually and then run Composer Update. So, because this isn't on regular packages, I have to tell Composer which package manager to go and get this from. So, in the repository section of composer.json, I tell it about this repository. So now when I run Composer Update or Composer Install, it's going to know where to go and look for these packages. So I can use the command line again, which is great if I also want to install development packages. So my debug bar is something that I don't want in production. I only want when I'm working locally. So I can use the dev flag when doing a composer require to make sure that only gets installed when I tell Composer that I wanted to install development dependencies. And that's where Composer starts to really become quite powerful for plugin management. So, so now I have these managed by Composer. I can ignore them from my version control, because I don't need to have these in my repository either. So I just ignore the whole plugins folder. And the .keep there is just to keep the folder itself, because I want the folder, but I don't necessarily want the contents of it. You have to excuse me, I've got quite a tickly throat now. So that covers my third-party plugins. What about my own plugin, my awesome plugin here? Well, option one is that I can leave it inside my repository. It can be part of my application. So if it's a single use, so I made this plugin for this project, I'm not going to use it anywhere else, I just leave it in my repository. It's part of my code that I need to maintain. Option two is that you can make it public and submit it to WordPress's plugin directory. But that can take a while, and if there's lots of plugins in the queue, then you're really at their whim. It's also likely you don't want it to be public. So option three is that, and I only recommend doing this if it's a plugin you want to reuse over and over again with lots of different WordPress installs, you can host the plugin itself in a repository on GitHub. And that's the same if you've got a private plugin that maybe you've purchased that you want to reuse and reuse, you can host your own version of it. And then you can pull it in with Composer. So here's my plugin in all its glory on GitHub. Note how awesome it is. And this is good because I can tag versions of my plugin. So I can lock different applications to different versions. So to explain that, if I've got my awesome plugin, which is version 1 of that, and I use it on my first site, and that's great, I then make it a little bit more awesome, and I push that up to my second site, and maybe as part of making that version 2, I broke some backwards compatibility. I mean, I probably have if I've called it version 2. So I don't want to necessarily update site A to have to use the latest version of this plugin, but because I've locked it in my Composer.json to version 1, it can carry on using the version 1 set of code. And therefore, I've got a single source for my code, like any other project that I'm working from, so I don't have to maintain multiple folders with different versions of this code and all that. malarkey. So this also means that I completely avoid the review queue, which is WordPress's own plugin directory as well. So let's look at my plugin a little bit closer. In here I've got a Composer.json file, so this is a file which is literally just there to describe what this package is, so Composer knows what it is when I use it. It's got my name and my description and stuff. Most importantly though, it's got the type of WordPress plugin. And I've required Composer installers, which I mentioned earlier, so when this gets installed, Composer will use the Composer installers package to know to install this into the right place. So now I'm back in my WordPress Composer file. I apologise, that's a bit of a jump from where we just were. That was the Composer file in my plugin. This is now back in my project, my WordPress project. And I can require this plugin. If it's mirrored on packages, then I can use Composer require on the bar line and this will just work. But that's only if it's public. If it's not mirrored on packages, which is more likely, then I add the repository, which is literally the GitHub repository, to Composer to say, hey, go look at this GitHub to get this package. The downside of doing this is that if you're running Composer on a server, for example, then you might need to set up SSH keys to talk between Git and, the Git repository like Bitbucket or GitHub and your server for it to have permission to actually pull those files. So that's the downside of doing this, but it is worth it if it's something that you reuse and reuse all the time. So all of our plugins here are now managed as dependencies. What about a theme? So in here I've got my awesome theme. I only have one theme as part of my app, so I do want it in the repo. It could be though, I'm using lots of third-party themes. And for that, I don't know why WordPress content just keeps coming in there. Really messed up my slides, sorry. So for that, I might want to ignore the themes folder as well, because all my themes are dependencies, all third party, and I'm pulling them in. And then if I've got one of those themes that is my own theme, I can not ignore that. It's a bit of a double negative though. To be honest, most of the time I find that I'm just using one theme for one WordPress site, and that is very specific to that WordPress site. So I don't bother doing any of that, I just keep it in my repository. Okay, so that's Composer. A caveat of this though is that well, your users can update things, but you probably don't want them to. If they click on that Update WordPress or that Update Plugin button, then what's on your server is now not what's in your repository. So again, we're getting out of sync and it's making our repository a bit less useful. So the easiest way to get around this for me is that I never give my users permission to update WordPress or update the plugins. I just make them a new role that isn't administrator, but has a lot of the same privileges. And there's plugins that can help you do that. So Members, for example, is one I use when I don't want to delve into the code and actually sort those permissions out within WordPress's code. There's lots of ways you can manage permissions in WordPress. This one though, you can use Composer to install. So yeah, we're really leveraging the advantage of having Composer in there. So Composer, we've got defined versions of our dependencies, we've got less third-party code in our repository, and we've got greater reliance though on third-party availability. So if one of the packages disappears from WordPress's directory, and therefore wpackages, then we've got a bit of a problem when we're trying to install our site. But I think we'd have that problem anyway, even if we weren't using Composer, so I don't think it's a big caveat. Uploads is something I'm going to talk about quickly. So one dependency we can't manage with Composer is our uploads. And I don't commit these. So again, in my git ignore, I'm told not to commit any of the uploads. I do that to keep my repository small, but also as soon as anything's uploaded to my repository, it's out of date. So, and I don't need any versioning of my uploads either. If I'm going to update an image, I replace the image, I don't make a different version of it. So if we don't keep a copy of our uploads in our repository, then what about backing them up, keeping a copy of them somewhere that's not just on the site? So personally, I back up all my uploads to Amazon S3. And I do that using the command line tool that runs on the cron task. It just runs every night, just copies anything new up to Amazon S3. There's plugins that can help you do that though, if you're not so au fait with the command line. This is an example. HumanMade have one. I've never used it, but apparently it's very good. I was talking to I think Jez earlier about there's another one. What was that called? WP Offload. Yeah. Yes. So one of Delicious Brains actually run their team actually runs WordPress boards. So small world. Okay, so with this example. And I think that's a paid plugin, but with this one's publicly available, so I can just use Composer. And you can really start to see how that speeds things up, just being able to go, Composer required, just Composer install this plugin for me. So now we have our uploads both on our server and backed up to Amazon S3. What about when we're developing locally? How do we get a copy of the files there? Well, the quickest way to do it is to run an rsync command on the command line, to just go and copy those files via SSH straight down. But again, if you're not quite as good with your command line foo, then you can just use FTP, for example, to do synchronizing. And again, there are plugins. I think Delicious Brains have a plugin which can help you do uploads as well. So there's lots of options there. But the main thing is that I've not got them in my repository, so I don't need version control, it keeps it small. I've got faster clone time and faster deploy time because of it. And I've got a remote copy of my backups, which is stored in S3. There are other cloud storage is available, S3 is what I use. So for databases, version control is tricky. You could add a MySQL dump to the end of each commit if you really wanted to go that far. There's actually a plugin called Revisor, I think, that does that. I've never used it again. It seems a bit overkill for me because WordPress is excellent at keeping revisions of your posts, so you can go back in time and look at how the post used to look like, and you can even see a diff, and that's all stored in the database itself. So all I really need to do is just keep a backup of it. And again, I use the S3 command line tool for that, but there are other solutions out there as well. To get a copy of the database locally, I just dump it on the server, copy it down to my local, and I install it. With databases, managing databases in a team, there's a lot of tooling that people have tried to create to solve the problem of managing databases and stuff. And I've found personally that the easiest solution is to just have a policy in place, which is my production database is my source of truth, and anything I do locally is throw away. So if I want to make a new page, I don't do it locally and then try and push that bit of the database up and do a kind of combination of that and what's on production. I make it on production and then I pull that down, and then so does my front end dev and all the other team, we're all just pulling from the same place. And that seems to work really well because we never push to production, we only ever pull from it, and we can't overwrite anything that way. So if you've got WP CLI installed, you can do something like this, but in a few less lines. So that's WP CLI is a really nice tool to use. And you can sort your databases out with PHPMyAdmin and FTP again if you want. There's a potential issue with moving databases around like this though, and that is that some of the settings need to be different depending on what environment you're on. So by environments I mean like your production server, but then you might also have a staging server, and then you've got your local version that you're developing on as well. You can even run WordPress on a Raspberry Pi or something like that if you really wanted to. So some of the settings that you have are going to be stored in WP config, and some of them are going to be stored in the database, and that's where the problem is. So to illustrate that, this is the WP options table for my production site, and then for my staging site, I've got some different values in there. So if I dump my staging site, my production site into my staging site, I've then got to go and update these values to correct them again so everything works. And that's a repeatable task. And WordPress has an admin screen. You can go to options.php, you can type those in the interface if you really want. But as I say, you have to do this every time that you want to sync what's your live database into what you're trying to work on. So here's a better solution. You can define things like home and site URL and lots of other settings in wp-config. And if these are defined, then WordPress will use these values instead of what's in the database. It'll actually just ignore what's in the database. And that has the advantage as well that it means that if your users do have the ability to go and find that options page and change some of the settings, it doesn't matter because it doesn't break anything. So the downside of this, of course, is that now we have to handle different code bases for different environments instead of different databases for different environments. So I just moved the problem, haven't I? So you could solve that by doing having environment variables. So this is Nginx, and I've defined an environment variable that will expose to PHP a variable to tell it which server it's running on. And then I can switch on that environment variable. You can also do things like try and look at the IP or the domain it's running on, but they're not foolproof solutions. This, if you're going to do anything, definitely do this if you want to do it this way. And then I can switch between those settings, but there are a lot of settings that are going to be different for different environments, and that's just going to be a really big switch statement, not very nice. There's also an added issue of this. So we've got our database credentials in a file that we commit up to our repository. And if you take anything away from this talk, I really want it to be never put passwords or any of your secrets, like your AWS keys or even your Google Maps API key, never put that in code that you commit to a repo. Even if the repo is private, you've got to think, can I make this open source at any moment? Or can I bring in a freelance developer onto this project without having to give away everything to them? To put it another way, there is now this website called GitLeaks. Who's heard of this? Has anyone seen this? So you can type in what you're looking for, and it basically searches GitHub for people who have committed publicly that code. So if I want an AWS key for something, I can just go and use someone else's. So my preferred solution to all of these problems is to use a library called .env. So it's a PHP library that defines environment variables, like I was showing that you can do with Nginx, but it does it just in a file which is within your code, so you don't have to go messing around with anything on the server. If you've used Laravel, you'll be familiar with this. And it has the added, as I say, it's got the advantage that you don't have to edit any vhosts or anything like that. And I can require it with Composer. So Composer require, and that will give me an extra file, an extra folder here. So that will give me the vendor folder. So this is not a WordPress packages thing, it's just a standard PHP library, so it's going to install to the vendor folder. And to get it to work, I have to make a file called .env, hence why it's called the .env library, it's well named. And in there, I put all my secrets, and it's just key value pairs of everything that WordPress needs to run, that it's going to be different in this environment, so this is production, or this is development, for example, to what my production one might look like. And there's my super secret password. To get this to work with WordPress, there's a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to use Composer's autoloader, which will mean that the .env class that's in that library is available to us in our code. So then I can use the static load method on the .env class to load that file in. You can call it anything you like, actually. And by default it will just work even if you don't specify a file. If you've called it .env, it will work. And then I define all of my settings, but instead of having all the values in here, I've just got references to the server environments, the server variables. There's a couple of ways you can do this. You can use $server, $env, or the getEnv function in PHP. They all work. Pick whichever you like best. So in here, it also gives some nice helper options like this one. So this required function means I can specify what I'm expecting to be in that file, in that .env file, and if anything's not in that file, then it will throw a .env exception, which just makes it a bit easier to debug why maybe my site's not working, because it tells me exactly why. I don't add this to my repository. Obviously, I don't want any of these secrets to be exposed, so I ignore that file, I don't commit it. And then I create this file manually. So I create it locally, and then I go to my production server and I create it on there, and I create it on my staging server. But I only need to do that once. And then if I want to go and edit any of these values, I can just go in and edit them. And that's all I need to do to change those values or to add new ones. If you're using provisioning scripts like Ansible or Puppet or Chef, you can generate this file using variables from your Vault, which is allowed to be in your repository because it's encrypted, so that's fine. And I'll explain a bit about provisioning in a minute. So our .env file is easy to locate and update. We've got one per environment, and it's not in source control, which means we're ready for open source. It's also easy to store outside of the web root. So just to explain what I mean by the web root is, that is the place where all of the website files are served to publicly to the internet from wherever that is in your server. Traditionally, it's somewhere like var www site, and this is a vhost file which defines that. Now, if you have the ability to access and change this, you can do something like this, where you can create have it as a different directory. So what I've done is I've created a folder here called web, and then I've moved all of the files that I need to be publicly available into the web folder. So that means that when I hit the domain, anything that's in that folder will be served, but anything at this level can't be accessed via the internet. And that's good because we've got my .env file there, which I definitely don't want people to look at, but also I'm not exposing information about the makeup of my site by exposing my Composer JSON file or anything like that. So in that web folder, it's just the things I need. So index, WP config, the WordPress folder itself, and the WP content folder. So just to summarize where we're at the moment, we're only keeping what we need in version control. We've got our dependencies managed. We've got backups of our uploads in our databases, and we've got isolated configuration of our environment. Now, I gave this talk at South Coast, and my friend Michael Heap pointed out that actually, this doesn't just apply to WordPress. This is just generally good stuff to do with any PHP application. And if you're asking yourself, how the hell am I going to remember all of this? I can see a couple of people just in the front here looking a bit like this. Well, that's where Bedrock comes in. So Bedrock is a boilerplate for this improved folder structure and this easier configuration. And it does pretty much everything I've just mentioned out of the box, except the S3 backup stuff. But as I say, there are plugins for that, or you can write your own command line scripts that will do that for you. So to use Bedrock, it requires some server configuration, specifically the chaining of the document root, which I just discussed. Sometimes I don't have the liberty of doing that. Sometimes on a shared host or something like that, or I'm doing something for a friend on something that they need to be able to easily maintain via FTP, and I don't want to mess around with that. And for that reason, I don't always use Bedrock. It depends on the situation, it depends on the client. And essentially, the reason why I didn't just make this talk like, here's Bedrock, was because I started using Bedrock, but then I delved in and actually found out what Bedrock changed, what it did under the hood, and how it used Composer. And it meant that I, by knowing basically what I've just been through here, that I can apply the bits that were useful when they were useful to projects. The best thing about Bedrock, though, is that it's got an active open source community. So there's a lot of clever people working on stuff and keeping it up to date, so I don't have to. For example, one of the dependencies that WordPress and Composer, that kind of bridge needed, got updated, and I didn't have to follow and keep up to date with the progress on that and follow their forums and look for the tag update and anything like that. All I needed to do was update my version of Bedrock when that came around. If you do use Bedrock, it's got a few naming differences. So the WordPress folder and the WP content folder, which I've talked a lot about, are not called those names in Bedrock. So they are called WP and app. And I like the name app actually, because as I said before, that's what I consider to be my application code. To do that, it's got some stuff at the bottom of its Composer JSON file, so you wouldn't need to write this if you use Bedrock, it just ships with it. What I'm just showing it here is that you can customize the naming of things. If you're trying to use this setup, you don't have to stick to the naming I've used. So the only downside to this naming change is it can cause issues if you're using a really old plugin that's got some sort of absolute URL where it's looking for an image or something that's in a plugin folder. It will try and use WP content as part of that URL. The way I got around that was, well, firstly to stop using really bad plugins like that, but secondly, when I had to, was I made a symlink. So you can do that using the command line. I think there are other ways you can do this as well that aren't command line to whatever your operating system is. But it essentially means that it's a shortcut that means if anything tries to go to WP content, it will send it into the app folder instead, and that just solves that problem. So if you do add a symlink to your project, you can store symlinks in the repository. You'll actually remember that relationship, so it'll work everywhere, including within a virtual machine. And I want to talk about virtual machines briefly. So when developing locally, you'll likely want to be using some sort of virtual machine or virtual environment. I use Vagrant. I've been messing with Docker recently, but I still use Vagrant most of the time for these things. And Vagrant is a virtual, I use Vagrant to manage my virtual machines. To quickly explain what a virtual machine is, essentially put, it's an emulated computer that runs from within your actual computer. I don't know if that's a great description of it, but it means you can install software on the virtual machine instead of on your actual machine, so you can keep your machine clean and of all that clutter. Why do we need one other than for that reason? Well, the problem comes that when you're developing a site, more than one site that have different software versions. So I'm using PHP as an example. So right now I'm using PHP 7.1. And my WordPress site works. That's great on my local machine. And I go and deploy that to my server that's running PHP 7.1. It's a new server I got from DigitalOcean. There we go. It works. But I've also got a really old site that I'm working on as well, and that server is running PHP 5.2. As I say, PHP is just an example. You could have different software such as the different web server, Apache Nginx, all sorts of different things. In this example, PHP 5.2, and I've used a PHP 7 function, which worked fine on my machine, because my machine has PHP 7, but the server doesn't, so I get a fatal error exception. So it's really pot luck on your deploys. I could uninstall PHP 7 and install PHP 5.2 to do that bit of development I needed to do on the old site, but who would really want to do that? So this is a better way. I've got a virtual machine running PHP 7.1, and I use that when I'm developing for my server that's running PHP 7.1, and I've got one that's running PHP 5.2, which I use for when I'm working on my 5.2 project. And then I know that everything I'm working on locally will work on my remote server. So my host machine is uncluttered, software versions are contained, and it's as similar as possible to production. The downsides of this is that the shared file system on Vagrant runs a little bit slow, and it's quite memory hungry, so you might be wondering why all your RAM's gone. So I've mentioned having a virtual machine which is identical to your production server. How do we ensure that they are similar? And that's where provision comes in. So I use Ansible. Chef and Puppet are alternatives, but they're quite heavy on the domain-specific language stuff, and they have big learning curves. Ansible doesn't. That's why I use it. So I have Ansible installed on my machine, and I use the Ansible script to tell Ansible that I want to install PHP 7.1, and then I run the script, and it will install PHP 7.1 for me on my virtual machine. So it's doing that work via scripts rather than me typing those commands in myself. And the best thing about this, it will do the same thing every time. So if I run it on my server, then I'll get the same thing, and I'll get it again and again every time I do it. So with Ansible, it means I can provision servers with a single command. I've got quite descriptive configurations. It's really quite nice how it works. and it's got idempotency, so every time I repeat it, it's going to be exactly the same, which means I've got reproducible servers. Now, originally I wrote my own Ansible script for doing a basic sort of lemp stack, you know, PHP, Nginx, that sort of thing. But it was a lot of work to keep it up to date with the rapid changing of WordPress and all the other things. And that's where Trellis came in. So Trellis is a project which is by the same guys as Bedrock. It comes with a Vagrant file, so it's got a virtual environment there already for you. And it comes with a playbook which you can run, you can use to make the virtual machine, but also to provision your servers with. It comes with multi-site and WP CLI out the box and lots of other extra goodies. It's got deploy script that will actually deploy your code up to your server for you, and it's got hooks in there, so if you want to put all your gulps and your grunts and what's it, Webpack now, and I have to ask my front-end developer about this stuff because I don't know, but he likes that I can do that for him. And it's got an active open source community again. The downside of it is that it usually does a lot more than you need. It's like WordPress itself, it's trying to be very versatile and serve lots of different needs, so it does install stuff that maybe you wouldn't install yourself. And it's quite fiddly to update. So this is how I've ended up doing it. I had to delve deep into their forums to find out how to keep Trellis up to date, and this is the same technique I use to keep Bedrock up to date as well. I add their repository as an upstream of my project, and then I fetch the upstream to get the latest from their, you know, all the latest commits, and then I do this kind of merge squash command, which I found, of that into my branch, and that does work. The downside of it is because I'm taking someone else's repository and trying to merge it with my own, Git doesn't know that those lines are the same in each file, so the files that have changed, I basically have a merge conflict on every line that's changed, and I have to go in and sort that out. But most of the time, it's just a case of clicking use theirs, because I know it's not a file that I've changed most of the time, other than the there's like 3 configuration files that you need to change to use Trellis, and that's it. So apart from those, I just go through and just like use theirs, use theirs, use theirs. So yeah, it's not quite seamless, but once you get used to it, it's not too bad. So Trellis is great for generic sites. If I'd gone and highly customized Trellis to do a lot of stuff that I needed to do with my server setup, then I'd have a lot more problems trying to update it because I'd have to start up all those merges. As a result, whether you should use Trellis or not, it depends on how much you want to customize it. I'm really on the fence. Thanks, I got a laugh this time. So my last section is autoloading. So we have a autoloader that comes as part of Composer. We've already added that to our project. It's at the very top of our WP content file. And we use that for getting .env, but we can actually use it for any PHP package we want. Anything that's on Packagist, or anything that isn't, if we want to add custom repositories. So, for example, Twig. Twig is my favorite templating language, and I use it with WordPress. And there's a plugin that can help map WordPress to Twig and get rid of all the complexities around the loop and things like that. And yeah, I can just compose and require that and start using it. I can do the same with Guzzle if I want to make HTTP requests. I can do it with Monolog if I want that mysteriously missing PSR3 logger that WordPress doesn't seem to have. Sentry if I want to do some nice collection of my logs. Whoops if I want some better error handling. I mean, literally any package you can think of, you can start using with WordPress. PHP Unit if I want to do some unit testing. Any of the Symfony components. So if you check out Three-Sided Cube's blog, I posted a blog very recently about how I'm using HTTP Foundation and Validator from the Symfony component with my controllers in WordPress. So it's at this point we can start to feel, we can start to use our CMS, which is WordPress, like we use our favorite frameworks. And so while we're working with WordPress, we start to feel like modern PHP developers again. So I've been Chris Sherry, thank you very much for listening. You can tweet me at tweetingsherry, or you can find me on the PHP Dorset Slack channel if you're interested in coming and having longer conversations. Thank you for listening. You've been awesome. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.